I feel like what you just said was potent. You said ego death is not annihilation, it's expansion, which I love that. And I feel like we are just moving through this eclipse. You were talking about it, and I'm so struck by it. I just had, like, within the last week, such a recognition of that. I feel like this whole year has been like a giant ego death cycle, and that it's always in service of expansion. I mean, obviously, our whole life is, but maybe that's not obvious. It feels like I feel like that was what became obvious to me is
Mm,
that there's so little it's not that we don't have to like I just think we can just like trust that we are always being guided to whatever the next iteration of our soul's expansion is.
mhm.
And the universe, I think, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, is like there's almost like a quickening in the extent to which the universe won't let us sort of be not passive, but like,
It's like
unwilling
sitting
to,
around and waiting.
yeah, like the ways that we have been in our limiting beliefs, our codependent tendencies, or sweeping things under the rug. Millie, our friend who's an astrologer, was saying the other day, like if something is out of alignment, it will like physically hurt now
Mm,
in a way that we could just be like, oh, I'm comfortable enough, or it would show up in other maladaptive behaviors. But now it's like, get it off me. I can't take this. Like I need to make this stop. This isn't right. This isn't true anymore. And it's
mhm.
because there's like a quickening in our individuation process.
Can you start by I think we should maybe start by, like, what would you consider, like, your definition of an ego death for people?
Since I just like
No, I think
um
that's a good I think we'll go back to that because I have some thoughts on this idea of quickening, which I'm obsessed with that word.
mm,
I think that's such a good word to use in this conversation. But
mhm.
what would you call like how would you describe that if a client was talking about it to you and you're like, oh, this is an ego death?
Yeah. I think about the ego in terms of like what we oftentimes are calling our personality is actually whatever sort of survival strategies or
Yeah.
ways we have learned to orient ourselves in the world based on our pain points, our conditioning, all of the experiences of our life. And a lot of times they're not actually things that are in alignment with the larger truth of who we are. And what I mean when I say this, and I think this comes up like a lot of times when we talk about like masculine and feminine energetics. And I will talk to you about the fact that like while I think in life you might present as a much more like linear, like in your
Mm,
masculine energetic, I do believe that like a lot of that is um it's not necessarily your core energetic, but it's like the survival strategies from life, right? Like, and I'm sure that's true of all of us, but and it is. But there are things that like this is how I have learned to orient in the world. But there are aspects of myself that as I heal and know myself more and come into a more embodied space, some of those things that we have been calling our personality, we see aren't actually in alignment with the truth, capital T truth, of who we are and who we want to be. And in that, a lot of times it's really confronting. And there's like a death rebirth cycle that we go through. And that's like the ego death. So it's like some of the things that we've utilized to keep ourselves safe have to fall away so that we can become who we have the potential to be.
yeah. I also, for those listening, I muted because I have dogs going crazy outside my wall here. The Costa
You
Rica
have dogs?
background.
You have dogs
No.
now?
There's just random there's always, there's a lot of street dogs here, so just every once in a while, you'll get a pack of them all barking at the same time.
Yeah.
Um, and you'll get mopeds going by and trucks going by and all the things. So the
Mm.
only thing I can't do much other than mute it here in Costa Rica. Um, yeah, I love that. I like this idea of, and I think you and I have talked about this before. Neither one of us really believe this idea of like, oh, the ego is something that needs to be, you know, needs to be killed or needs to be
Annihilated.
annihilated. Yeah, that's the word I'm thinking of. Like, I think there was kind of a shift into that way of thinking for a while, maybe in like the
Mm.
wellness space or whatever. Um, but I know we both don't agree with that, right? Like to your point, there is a lot of protection actually that the ego provides us. That's really important protection, especially when we're younger and we're just kind of figuring ourselves out and we're kind of new on this path of life and individuation.
Mhm.
And I think perhaps it becomes less and less important as we get older, but not,
Mm.
I don't think ever completely not important, right? But it just becomes perhaps your relationship changes to it more and you're better able to see like where ego ends and where like
Mm.
your self begins.
Yes.
So they're less like connected, in that way. But I like what you're saying about it has to happen, right? This concept of ego death has to happen for you to become who you're becoming, right?
Yes.
And I talk about this ego death concept in terms of like this idea, which a lot of you have heard, this like maiden mother crone or maiden mother queen, right? Or maiden queen crone, like basically this transition in a woman's life into these different stages. You use, what's the one that you use a lot? What's the one I'm missing? The archetype that I'm missing?
Oh, like
Enchantress.
the enchantress archetype
Yeah. And
or
so the thing
witch?
is, yeah, or witch. The thing is when you go from maiden to queen or maiden to mother, right? Or enchantress, it's not that the maiden qualities disappear entirely, right? I think this is going back to what we were saying about I think your relationship to them changes. I think you see
Mm.
them in a different light. I think you integrate things differently. And I think to your point, what felt untrue when you were in that stage of life is now something that you can't deny anymore.
Yeah.
You can't you can't just go along to get along anymore. And I think it happens multiple times in our lives, right? And hopefully, I mean, it should happen multiple times in our lives, unless we're, well, no, let me rephrase that. It will happen multiple times in our lives. It's either going to be something that is transformative and you are able to like make sense of it and integrate the growth that's happened, or it's going to happen and you're going to be like holding on with your claws and
Mm.
it's going to shake you in a way that it wouldn't shake you if you weren't kind of open to this is what life looks like, right? This is what transitions in life look like.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about what you were saying about like the way that each of us hold the relationship to the ego. And to me, the ego is identification with this physical form, and soul is the awareness that we are eternal beings, right? Now, I think we have lived societally with just um like a consciousness that believes that we are just these physical bodies. Like that is a
Mm-hmm.
lot of what we're taught
Mm-hmm.
versus societal structures or ways of being where you are sort of raised with an awareness that like there is meaning and there is something beyond like I don't know, a 401k and what you accumulate in this physical body. But that's something that I believe is like the transition of the
Mm-hmm.
template from sort of this wounded masculine paradigm that we've been living into the awareness of our inner feminine, which is our soul. And the reason I'm saying that is because I think there's so often the resistance to the things of life.
Mm.
It's funny. I just posted something where someone was like, "I love this, and I always have the worry about the spiritual bypassing." Right? And my love, here's the thing: a lot of times, what I find we are calling quote like the spiritual bypassing is our resistance to the understanding that we are not just these physical bodies, right? Like
Mm.
it's like that integrated awareness. Like Caroline Myss often says, like, there's an understanding that there should be struggling in life somewhere, just not in my house, right? Like the
Mm-hmm.
ego will
Mm-hmm.
say, like, I shouldn't struggle though,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Should happen to
And
me.
if we understand, like, of course you will. That's what we all came into this human incarnation to do. And that's not actually bypassing. That is the acceptance of this is the stuff of life. We came here to
Yeah.
to have things that sort of shake us awake, because you often like talk about feather brick Mack truck, right? Those things are designed by our soul to awaken us, and when we hold it as like none of this is random. I find a lot of times people are like, well, that's just bypassing the pain, and I'm like, I don't think so. To me, it's just the acceptance that like nobody said we got to go through this life without pain. That was not sort of the agreement we signed up for, you know what I mean?
No, and I actually think what you're saying here is really important because let's differentiate when people say, how do I explain this? Like when people say what you're saying is spiritual bypassing, I actually think what you're speaking to is the opposite of spiritual bypassing because in order to make sense of something, And no one is saying to like rush to the place of meaning making. That is one thing I'm very like opposed to. And that can feel very bypassy to me, right? Because that does actually become very logical.
Mhm.
But the idea of like, I don't know, the word that's coming up for me is reverence. So when we give reverence to these moments in our life that are painful, right? That feel like disorientation, that feel like the bottom's falling out from underneath us, that feel like these ego deaths, right? That feel so uncomfortable. But when we turn to them with reverence and we say, okay, here it is.
Mm.
I don't like it because let's be honest, nobody's ego likes pain or suffering, right? I don't like it. And yet I know that this is here for a reason, that this is teaching me something, right? And not in like the platitude way of like everything happens for a reason, but more just like, okay, I'm gonna welcome this with open arms kind of reason. I think what we're not doing bypassing, what we're actually doing is facing the pain, because suffering, right? I mean, this is Buddhist psychology. Buddha would say that suffering is actually created by not paying attention to the pain, by looking away from the pain, or by trying to push the pain away, or by ignoring it, or by, right, that's actually what creates suffering, is the tension that is caused by not allowing and accepting what is, right? And so I think there's a way that we can turn toward and acknowledge and feel into. There's a reverence in that, I think, that doesn't say, okay, now I'm going to be in that stage forever and ever. Like I'm going to allow myself to be in pain and suffering forever. That's not what we're saying. But to honor these transition in our lives requires attention. It requires a turning towards, it requires honoring.
Hmm.
And I think that might be something I know for me personally, but also I see it in clients all the time. That's the part that people struggle, I think, the most with in these stages, is the turning towards, the honoring.
Yeah, I want to stay on spiritual bypassing because obviously, like, I have a lot of opinions because, and we've talked about this before. I think a lot of times the tools that have been my lifeline and the things that have had the most transformational impact on my life are the things that I find, certainly in the personal development sphere, people are describing as spiritual bypassing.
Hmm.
And one, I would say, when you say that often, it's because it has not been your survival
Sure.
strategy that you have utilized. And that's why you're calling it that. But to me, so often the actual bypassing, well, two things. The actual bypassing, a lot of times, is in this idea that anybody has an easy life, or that like
Mm.
any of like, and not even easy, but that like life is just supposed to be comfortable all the time. Like that's,
Hmm.
sort of that like sweep it under the rug. If we don't
Hmm.
talk about it, it doesn't exist. Like, and that is what most of what the paradigm that most of us were raised in, like, don't air your dirty laundry, like only show
Hmm.
the people the things that look good. Like that to me is the bypassing, right?
Hmm.
Like the not allowing for our humanity to be seen, but also I feel like we have a very codependent relationship with the concept of spiritual bypassing. And some of this to me feels very recent, where
Hmm.
everybody's running around pointing the finger at who
Hmm.
is bypassing. And it's like, perhaps thou
Look in the
might
mirror.
point the finger back at
Hmm.
yourself and ask yourself why it feels so activating for you. Because if someone is bypassing, that's where they are in their process, right?
And it's
And it's
not for
like,
you to tell them that they're bypassing or not.
yeah. It's like there's a reason that people who've struggled with alcoholism don't run around at bars and tell people to like
Hmm.
wake up and stop drinking. It's because nobody awakens because they're like beat into submission. That's not how it happens. So if someone is coping with what you experience as a form of bypassing, I think the work is to be really curious about why that feels so unbelievably difficult for me to tolerate, and say, like, all of it is a mirror to myself. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I mean, if we're going to use you as an example for a second, I think like even
Sure.
I think even in knowing you for the last 10 years, what I would say, like if I'm pulling back and I'm looking at it objectively, what I
Mm.
would say is maybe your go-to for like your coping, which to your point, some people would look at and say, oh, that feels like bypassing. I've actually watched you in the last few years recognize sometimes when you're doing something that was a coping skill in that way. And I've actually heard you say, I know I have a tendency to get in my head, right? To try to make sense of something so that it feels better, like as quickly as I can, right? Not be
Totally.
in it. But I've watched you over 10 years. Like I would say to your point, it's like everybody's process is going to be different. And to exactly what you were saying, like what was working for you at some point in your life, there's a different understanding or a different relationship to it now,
Mm.
where that's just where you are. And so now that's how you're turning, or that's how you're orienting towards these experiences. Whereas, 7 years ago you weren't. And is that a bad thing, or is that just where you were on your journey? Right. I mean, obviously the same goes for me, but I'm just saying this because I've obviously objectively watched you evolve and grow. And so I think it's also really important, to your point about looking at ourselves, something actually to even like sit with is, and I'm in my mind, I'm actually thinking about myself right now. Like, take the last 5 years, 10 years, and look at the ways that you used to cope with something hard,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
10 years ago, 5 years ago, and look at the ways that you're doing it now. What's different? Is it different? Right? What insight do you have now that you didn't have 5 years ago? What understanding about yourself do you have now that you didn't 5 years ago? Right. Um, and I think that that's actually a really important kind of, I don't know, practice to do, because it does help you look at yourself and see the evolution.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that it's like people heal, evolve, however we want to describe it on their own timeline. And
Hmm.
absolutely, like I will be the first to own and often own that a lot of times my survival strategy or my coping mechanism is to go straight to the meaning making, right? And
Hmm.
like that sometimes like that could conceivably be considered spiritual bypassing, I guess, by someone externally. But the point to me is we are only able to meet ourselves to the extent that we've met someone else, or we're only able to meet others to the extent that we've met ourselves. And so it's, I always get there with whatever the like larger thing the universe is trying to show me when it's
Hmm.
time for me to be seen. Why can't I speak?
I mean, I get what you're saying.
You're like,
I'm
I'm
picking up
tracking
what you're
you.
putting down.
Yeah, but it's like I always get the lesson when it's time for me to get the lesson. What I find
Yeah,
we are
right.
doing often collectively is we are robbing other people of the dignity of their process
Yeah.
because it's like uncomfortable for me to see something that you don't see. And obviously we come from like the therapy reference or perspective of like allowing people to be where they are because a lot of
Hmm.
times it's just like really disruptive to someone's process for you to get in there and be like you're spiritually bypassing, like
Yeah.
if nothing else they're going to be defensive, but certainly that does not support them in understanding like why they're in resistance to whatever they're in resistance to right now.
Yeah. I mean, it always goes back to looking at your own activation, right? And like, why is this activating me, instead of like putting it out there on the other person and being like, you're activating me. You should change and be different so that I'm not activated, right? I mean, we could use this for everything and anything as far as an example. I was just thinking about how it's funny, like when I think of me, you, and John, I don't know why this just popped into my mind, but do you not remember I sent
Oh,
you?
we're going there.
Yeah,
I'm
we're going
just
there.
kidding.
When I sent you a thing a couple weeks ago on Instagram, actually our friend Tawny sent it to me, where it was like this woman did like a poll of like 100 therapists or
Mm,
whatever, and it was all their different signs, and so she did just the big three, right? And
yeah.
I thought it was hilarious because Capricorn, which is you, sun sign specifically, Capricorn, you, Aries, John, Taurus, me, were the three lowest percentage
Of
for
therapists.
therapists. We were like 2% each of us, right? And I was like, there's something in this that I find really funny, that the three of us, are the lowest percentage, and we've kind of all found each other in a way. And I think that, with you and I, well, and I would say John too, but with you and I, when we first connected, a lot of our conversations were around how embodiment practices
Mhm,
were our way into spirituality, right?
mhm.
And I'm guessing it's because we can tend to be very neck up people, right? Like, I don't know if it's our Libra moons or whatever it is, but like, I don't like feelings. So I'm just gonna, I
Hey,
can
keep
talk,
those away.
I can talk my way out of them. Let me just stay up here. And I would say John's very similar. And also, John came into healing through CrossFit, which he had never
Mhm.
done. And when he started doing it and getting in his body, everything started to change, right?
Yeah.
So I guess I'm on this tangent because I was thinking about how, for me personally, when I feel myself in a state of, and I don't know, maybe I would call this bypassing. I'm not really sure what you would think about this, like if this matches up with that word. I guess what I'm thinking is like when I'm in a state where I have a moment of like, holy crap, I've been in it for too long. Like it
Mm.
feels like bypassing to me when I blink my eyes and like a week has gone by and I've been in a state of being busy.
Mhm.
So for me, busyness is a way to bypass
Yeah.
feeling, right?
Mhm.
And if I have that aha and I'm like, oh, holy shit, like I have been operating the neck up, it's leaning into the opposite that helps me come into kind of right relationship with it, right? So for me, that's leaning into the body. So for me, it's like, oh, it's not necessarily like lifting weights kind of working out. It's more like intuitive movement or yoga or, you know, whatever. But anyway, I mean, it's kind of a bird walk, but I guess I'm just thinking about if somebody's saying like, how do I even know if I'm bypassing? I was thinking to myself, well, like what feels like the uncomfortable thing to do in this process? And sometimes you have to like lean into that a little bit. Like the uncomfortable thing for me to do when I'm in a busy state is to slow down and get in my body.
Yeah.
But then I kind of know that that's what I need, you know?
Yeah. And, well, two things come up as I hear you say that. Like, I don't think I ever am like, oh, I've been bypassing, or oh, I haven't been like, I think I say this to my therapist sometimes. I'm like, God, the amount of space you have given me to just like project about something, like, and pontificate for like a year. And you're always like, totally. I'm like, God, bless you. Cause she like lets me be in my process. And she's like, Dene, that's often like the richest work you do
Mhm.
is when you're like in an obsessive state about,
Mhm.
guys. I'm joking. But but I think it's life will show you, I guess is my
Right.
point. Like I will all of a sudden like have like a oof, like wake up with just like clarity around something and I'm like, whoa, I see it clear. And I don't like you can't tell me other ways. And I just think we're so afraid of getting it wrong or not being like where we need to be. And I think that's a little bit like my resistance to the spiritual bypassing conversation
Mm.
is we're just so friggin' critiquing of ourselves. I'm like, well, how do I know if I'm bypassing? It's like, just let life show you what you need to be shown when it's time for you to see it. We're so afraid of getting it wrong, and you can't get life wrong, y'all. Like, I don't know. It's my opinion. Hell, I'm gonna die on, but like, I just don't think that's the case. But I do
Yeah.
think, and what I thought you were gonna say about you, me, and John is like, I think in our relationship, there have been times where, I think it's just a lot of times we will feel like we know what is best for someone we love and we don't know. And I think that that's like sometimes our like biggest work around codependency is to me like I don't actually know what is the right path for you. I don't know like whatever that looks like. And I think that's certainly been something I was going to say in our dynamic, but I'll own like sometimes for me that I'm like, like this is what you should and you're like yo, and I think that that's something it has taken me a while to sort of like really even identify in myself that sometimes I can do, and we've had conversations around that. But I think the closer you are to someone and the more that you love them, sometimes you can just feel like I know what's best for you when it's like you actually don't know what's right for another soul and what their path is meant to be. Am I rambling? Am I making sense?
Yeah, no, I'm thinking I mean, I think there's two things, right? I don't know what you think about this, but when you say that, what comes up for me is like there's ego in it, right? Which is like the
Mhm.
thinking that we know best.
Mhm.
That's, I mean, codependency, but that's the ego kind of at play. But then there's also, which is really, I mean, look, this is why I say to people all the time in the codependency work, like, no one is saying that these behaviors are malicious in intent, right? Like,
Mhm.
most of us are doing it because we care, and so it's both things, right? It's like there's a little bit of ego in it, but then there's also this like I want you to stop suffering or my perception of your suffering. And so I'm trying to fix it or change it or make it better through the way that I think it should be done so that you stop suffering. Now, partly the codependency side is also so I stop suffering,
Still
right?
selfish. Still
Right.
about me like struggling to see
It's
you
still about
suffer.
me struggling, right? But I think that that is what it takes work to get to that place, right? To
Mm.
understand that it's both things happening at the same time, you know? I mean, we're not completely uncaring people. It's like, no, of course, somebody in our life is struggling. We want them to stop struggling, right? And so that's why we swoop in. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I was just thinking about how all of these, and going back to that conversation around ego, like maybe as we continue to evolve and we do this work, even the work around codependency recovery, I think partly my slow recovery process, of course, is interwoven with the multiple ego deaths that I have
Mm.
experienced along the journey. Because it's almost as if, I mean, I say it's almost as if it probably is, it's almost as if every time I come up against something, right? That I'm really struggling to understand, let go of, a behavior trait or relational trait that I'm like working with, there will inevitably be some kind of ego death that happens when it's time for me to really understand it and really
Mm,
let it go, or like maybe change my relationship to it is a better word than let it go.
mhm.
So I mean, to use this example, right? I very much know now that, and some people are going to cringe when they hear this. I think this is beautiful, but I very much think that so many reasons, but one of the reasons that John and I collided is because one of my biggest wounds always has been around being not enough
Mm,
slash too much, which is the same wound, right? And John and my dynamic was a constant in the beginning of our relationship, was a constant like finger in that wound, right?
mm,
And I said, when we had our wedding in November of last year, I said out loud, like in our vows, what I wrote. And a lot of people there thought this was romantic, the way that I said it. But those people who were in my inner circle that knew the work that I had done in our relationship had a lot different takeaway of this sentence when I said to him, it is through you that I truly believe that I am enough. It is through our collision, like basically something I said like that. And people thought it was romantic, meaning I was like, oh, he makes me feel like I'm enough. That is not what I was saying. What I was saying is it is through our collision and the over and over and over again of me having to face this wound that I actually finally had this death of this version of myself that was looking to somebody else to heal that wound. And I
mm.
don't believe that anymore. I truly don't. I mean, does it get activated once in a while? Of course, but it's so few and far between and it's so much less than it ever was. And I do believe it's been through that collision that I have come to that real understanding. But there was a death that had to be had, right? To get to that place.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I think when we talk about it relationally, so much of what I am challenged by is the conversation. And I think people often misunderstand what I'm saying in the context of what you just described, in that I don't actually think it is your partner's responsibility to reparent you, right? They will activate you and they will cause you to feel all kinds of stuff that require you to reparent yourself. But the model that we've sort of been drawing from historically has been like, you are the person that is going to like sort of step in where your partner's parents left off, and you're going to heal all that stuff for them, and you're going
Save
to
me.
give them that unconditional positive regard. And I'm like, good luck with that. First of all, I've never seen another human being who has the capacity and the ego strength to do that consistently for another person, because human beings are in relationship with other wounded human beings, right? So to imagine that this person, as we're often sold, can be that perfect parent for us is silly season. But also, I think what they are is what you're describing. They are a mirror. They are going to evoke all of our junk so that I can say, oof, why is this so activating for me? Why am I in so much pain around this? I wonder if there's something that I am meant to understand about when I want to grasp, or I want you to fix, or I want you to make this better. And to me, that's what I'm saying all the time when I'm like, I think we need to stop like parenting each other in terms of the way that we're instructing the work of partnership. It's not that there aren't reparative experiences, and it's not that like we won't in relationship heal some of those things, but it's more what you're describing. It's more, I heal because I take responsibility for this person is bringing all this stuff up so that I can really get clear and in right relationship with it, not so that they can be that for me, because that's always going to be an outsourcing of our power to me.
Yeah, and I was thinking, like, as I've said that before, and I think I've actually, obviously, I spoke about this with John at some point, and it really kind of like hurts his heart a little bit when he thinks about the fact that that's what I'm saying, meaning that
Hmm.
he knows, he sees his part in poking that wound, right? But I'll
Hmm.
tell you, in that understanding, there's also been the mirroring back, which is his mirrored wounding, I suppose, is this idea of like, let me make people do for me what I think that they should do for me. Let me make the woman in my life mother me in the way that I wasn't mothered. Let me force there was a lot of like, a lot of ego, right? A lot of like forcing and like, this is what she needs to do and this is what she needs to be. And I'm going to get her to do this. And so I think that again, it's this mirror of like, I was able to see and heal that wound for me. And again, still work in progress, and vice versa. Whereas he was able to hear that, and instead of getting defensive, really have a reckoning with himself around the way that he showed up in a way that was constantly making somebody feel like they're not enough, right? Like, what was his
Mhm.
part in that kind of thing? So, anyway, to just say, like, to wrap it back around to this concept of ego death, like, I am so far removed from the version of myself that I was when if we're talking relationally, when I met him almost 8 years ago at this point, which is insane. I'm so far removed even from like the version of myself that I was when you and I met like 10 plus years ago. I mean, of course, there's semblances of who that person is, right? But there's been so many ego deaths in the last 10 years. It's like hard to even name them.
Yeah. I think it's important to name them as like these moments become ego deaths, and that is sort of the purpose of relationships, that
Hmm.
like we come together in these collisions and they're like it's by design, and we understand that none of this is random. Then, people say so often we heal in relationships because we were wounded in relationships, and I'm often like, a lot of times we don't, though. A lot of times what we're doing is we're sort of hiding out in the bunker
Yeah.
together, um, not like taking responsibility for like, why is this so activating?
Or
Like
living
what
in the wound, right? Like we're just living in it constantly.
or playing it out and like resistance. And if
Yeah.
you could
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
change, and when you
Yeah.
change, then
Right.
I'll exhale, and all of
Right.
these things like that are not what you're describing to me. Like the responsibility is it's not actually for another person to change or shift. It's for me to get curious about why this is so difficult. And then absolutely we can heal in relationships. But I think to just say like we need to be in a relationship to heal, I
Hmm.
actually see a lot of times ways that we are just like perpetuating our pain
Hmm.
points in
Agreed.
relationships if we don't take responsibility for, you're not my savior. Like that was never meant to be your role. And I think, what's interesting about what you were saying, um, about like, John taking that responsibility, is we were having this conversation based on something you brought up yesterday, that I think there's just so much within, what I think the masculine collective or men right now are being challenged by, which is, and I was asking a group of men in our process group, like, what do you guys think about this? And they were just saying, like, yeah, it's really, really hard to be in the space of the unknown, which is again like the feminine, like vast
Hmm.
darkness, right? And so there's so much about, because so often I will be like, well, here's how women experience this. And I will hear men literally say, no, they don't. That's not true. I'm trying to like, I don't know. I'm a woman. I speak to, maybe I don't know a lot about being in a man's skin. I've never done that in this lifetime. Right. So perhaps you know something about being a man that I don't. Right. But I don't think, and I could be wrong and I'm happy to be corrected, but I don't think women have as much of that. Like, that's absolutely not the experience of men. It's like, as men have about women, like, cause there's like a real defense against that.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think the ego death in that is
Hmm.
the mother wound, right? And the way that I am experiencing some of these truths about like women and where they are and how they perform and experience things that are uncomfortable for me to see. And that becomes a like, oof, so did my mom feel all
Yep.
that, right? Was like, was I that to her? And it's just,
Mm.
I don't know. I think it's coming up a lot collectively.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that even taking it outside of the men and women conversation, I think this is what you see happening so often around like the conversations around like fragility and the conversations
Mm,
around like privilege and the conversations around, I think especially in the West, well, I would actually say everywhere, but just coming from a Western perspective, we're in such a state of reckoning right now of like seeing who we've been
mm,
in order to not repeat mistakes, but also to like change the trajectory of where we're going as a species, right?
yes.
And that's been really hard for a lot of people because it's like it's forcing people to have to reckon with the harm and the pain that their ancestors caused. No one is saying that they necessarily did it themselves, but it's hard to see, and it's hard to not get defensive about it. And I think it's a similar thing that we're seeing with a lot of the defensiveness with men is I don't want to see that because somehow it makes me feel shame. It makes me feel like I'm a bad person. It makes me feel like I'm not enough. It makes me feel, all of these things come up. And so yeah, I don't know. I feel like I'm kind of watching that play out in so many spheres right now.
Yeah, I think it's what you so often say. I think it's like learning to have that differentiation of like, this thing has been bad, and that does not mean that I am bad. And I
Right.
feel like there's such a resistance to the idea um, that there have been things like all of those different spheres that you're talking about that we've all been a part of, we've all been complicit in, and we can't shift or change what we can't acknowledge. And so until we say like, absolutely, and that's a part of the ego death, right? Like I
Mhm.
have been doing whatever I needed to do because I didn't know how to do anything different at the time. And that does not make me a bad person. That
Mhm.
makes me at the level of consciousness that I was operating from at the time. I was operating from that level of consciousness. But now that I know better, I have an
Mhm.
opportunity to do something different. And I think until we normalize that or we make that like something like within ourselves that is okay, it becomes really hard to move forward because then we're just like in that stuck space of defensiveness and life will give us an ego death if that's where we are. So it's all perfect, but
Yeah, that's the
you
thing.
know,
Yeah, is you can try your best to resist it, but the psyche's going to make it happen whether you like it or not, right?
that's
These
right.
things happen. This is the process of individuation. And if we know that the psyche actually requires initiation to
Hmm.
move forward and integrate, you can grow up. Like biologically, you become an adult, right? You don't have to have an initiation to become an adult biologically. And yet, if you want to evolve, if you want to grow in the sense of development, spirituality, like all of these things that you and I are talking about, there's going to be initiation. And initiation
Hmm.
is usually not pretty. Initiation is usually not comfortable. It requires what we're talking about here, which is, there's a reason why we call it ego death. Like there is discomfort inherently in it. There is a loss inherently in it. There is grief inherently in it. There is rage and anger inherently in it. Like that is part of this process. I mean, I would say that our country is in the precipice of its own ego death right now. We're watching it happen, right? And it's in the state of struggling. No, I won't do it. Like we're not doing what you and I were saying in the very beginning of this conversation. There's not that reverence. There's not that turning toward. There's not that like allowance. So many, maybe some people are, but so many right now in the West in particular are doing that thing I was saying. They're gripping. Nope, nope. I'm not going to have this ego death. Nope. And it's like, okay, well, keep struggling. Like it's going to happen. It's just going to happen either with a lot more struggle or not. Like you choose.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's why I've often been so grateful for our background in depth psychology because over the last 5 years, so much of what we've been saying, where the conversation, I think the lens that we're viewing so much of what is happening is our collective shadow is rising to the
Mm-hmm.
surface so that we
Mm-hmm.
can come into right relationship with the distortions that have always been there. But none of this
Mm-hmm.
happens in a vacuum. I don't care, what your political beliefs are, what side you're on with anything. It is always, I am being shown the aspects of myself that I have been unwilling to look at. And that's for all of us. I think again, that to me is the bypassing. A lot of times, like if we're talking about the ways that my activism is in resistance to something, and I am like, here's what other people aren't doing that they are needing to do. It's like that, what is it? Chameleon effect. And I
Mm-hmm.
start to become the thing that I am fighting against. And that is my shadow work. That is like where my ego is in that space of like, in what is it? Righteous indignation and like, just like that space of like
It's addictive.
knowing that we are right. And it is, it's absolutely addictive. Like beautiful word for it because it becomes like the high
Mm-hmm.
that I think we are. Yeah, I think we're in it right now. I think we are
Mm-hmm.
in an ego death. It's, and I don't feel afraid because like I was just looking at all of these different cultures that talked about this period of time and that like there were all of these prophecies like we've talked about like
Mm-hmm.
some but like they all said this was going to be the collective space of the death of what was no longer a sustainable paradigm. And when we understand that, all that you just said, yes, it feels like chaos. Yes, it feels like rage. Yes, it feels like mess. And we have no collective, um, what's the word I'm looking for? context. We have no
Mm,
collective context for what an initiatory period looks like or what a
mhm,
threshold of initiation is. And because we are moving through something that is no longer serving us, we have to hold the larger vision of like, this is who
mhm.
we're becoming. But it's never comfortable for us to go through an ego death, whether that's individually or collectively.
Yeah, we have no context. And I also think collectively we struggle with capacity, like
Mm.
capacity to be in it. Right. And so I think when you look at what you were saying about the background of depth psychology, so often we talk about how like depth is you cannot separate the collective from the personal.
Mhm.
And so the work that you and I do, whether it's with women or men too, around, individuation and codependency recovery and all these things that we talk about, it's like, yes, somebody could say, oh, setting boundaries in your family is individualistic. Is it? Or is that
Mhm.
going inward and creating a tolerance in myself for discomfort of disappointing somebody actually going to translate out into the collective of what is needed during this time, which is
Right.
a bigger capacity for discomfort, which is a bigger capacity for going against the grain and saying, this doesn't align with me. I'm not okay with this way of being, and I'm going to stand in that truth. Right. So it's so often, and I know you know this because you get this all the time, right? So many times I hear this idea of like what we're talking about is hyper individualism, and what we're saying is for people to be out of community and for women to be on their own and all these things. And I was writing this note before we started talking about this where I said ego death actually reconnects us to soul and community.
Mm.
Because when we're not protecting our ego, when we open a deeper connection.
I love that.
So ego is about self.
Yes.
Right? Soul is about connection. Soul is actually about self and other. It's about openness. It's about expansion. And so long as we're in that state of restriction and we're not allowing for that ego death, we actually are all about the self. So, yeah.
Yeah. I've just been so obsessed for the last few months with this idea of like why I've stopped talking about interdependence
Mm,
and started talking more about like constellations of sovereignty. And that I think because there's, you know, even in the interdependent conversation, what I think is the way people talk about it is like we need one another
we
and
need
we
each other.
need
Mm,
like there's like a scarcity or a lack or a
right.
dependence, right? Where there's not a lot of trust in the larger like unfolding as we're talking about in that. And to me, what a lot of times we are missing in conversations about community is we are still sort of approaching community from a power over stance, and
Mm.
that's what you're describing. Like we're pointing the finger at people and saying, you aren't you aren't in community.
Getting
You're
very worked up
focused
about
on
this.
I'm like, "God," um, but you're focused on hyper individualism. And I always
Mhm,
come back to like the 12-step model and what actually creates a space where you feel invited in and safe to come
mm,
into community. And one of the first things people say to you when you are entering a recovery space is, we will love you until you know how to love yourself. Not
mm,
like, let us sit here and berate you for all of the things that you've done while you were active in your addiction, but like, as you are enough. You don't need to
mhm,
change. And that is what I think actually cultivates community. And it's like, all of us are on our own individual sovereign journey. Our soul's journey has been exactly what it has been meant to be, but I'm going to love you there, right? Like that's what safety and community is, not the power over model that we still draw from when we talk
mm.
about like how people need to comply with what we think need to be the standards of how we formulate community, which is so much of what I keep hearing and seeing in the cultural zeitgeist.
God, it just reminds me, I'm so bad at name recall. Who's that comedian who he's a comedian. He's a white guy. He's got blondish hair, and he tends to speak a lot about religion and spirituality in a way that's refreshing because it's comedic, but it's so fucking deep. He was on Rainn Wilson's podcast. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Blondish hair?
Yeah, God, I know people
I
listening are
don't
probably going to know who I mean. But anyway, I saw a
know.
clip with him the other day, and he was talking about how, and I'm going to butcher this. I'm going to find it. Maybe I'll like share it somewhere like in the show notes or something when we publish this episode. But he was talking about how this idea of forgiveness, and he was talking about it just reminded me when you were saying in 12 step, like this idea of we will love you until you love yourself. He was talking about the concept of forgiveness he was talking about parents, and he was saying like this
Mhm.
way that we hold it of like, well, they did the best they could, or they did it how they could do it with all the tools they had at the time. He said,
Mhm.
well, sure, it's true. He was saying something about how that version of forgiveness is different than um he was talking about the word mercy.
Mm.
And I just thought it was so beautiful because he was like talking about the idea that true forgiveness is actually a form of mercy, and what it really comes through is
Huh.
self-love.
That's a
So
really good
like
point.
I can only give you mercy if I can give myself mercy, right? And so maybe what he was saying is like that other version of forgiveness is logical, right? It's like a this makes sense, and I can wrap my head around this, and I can keep repeating this to myself, and they did the best they could with what they had. That doesn't come from this place of like the soul, which is really more about mercy. I just thought it was so beautiful. I'll see if I can find it. But anyway, that's what reminded me when you said that.
Yeah, there's something about, like, you speaking to the word mercy that, like, made me feel emotional, and I think it's
Mm.
because how do we attempt to love one another as God, Source, loves us? And there's a way that even in like, we talk about forgiveness, whether we're talking about our parents or other people, where it is still a power over. Like,
Totally.
I have the ability to forgive you because I am in this hierarchical position of the person who is righteous, who knows right, and I think there's you know, I don't believe our source ever sees like right or wrong. It is always like things were what they had to be
Hmm.
for us on a soul level to understand whatever it is that we are meant to know. But um yeah, I think that there's something in the word mercy that just feels like God's love to me, which
That's right.
I believe is what we're learning right now
Yeah.
collectively.
So it's Pete Holmes is who I was talking about. And it's
Hmm.
the teaching that he's referencing is from Father Greg Boyle
Is he
on mercy.
blonde?
He is blondish, like blondish.
That's
He's
what
not
I was
like,
thinking about, but I was like, the
yeah, yeah.
blonde threw me.
I said
I just like
blondish. I was like, because he's not
I
brown,
was
like
like,
brunette.
"Is that blonde?" Would you because I
I
started
don't
like, "Who is
know.
on Soul Boom that's blonde?" I was literally like I thought that might be who you were talking about, but then you said blonde, and I was like, "Oh, that's not who she's talking about." Yes, I really love his
He
work.
said forgiveness is
His
overrated. Mercy is where it's at. And mercy comes from me recognizing that you and I are actually the same thing. And when you can experience that
Mm.
really, really deeply, deep down, then you can actually forgive because you recognize it's kind of, I'm like literally reading what he's saying. It's our dream, and you're just kind of here so I can learn who I am.
Oof,
And if I
that's
want to know
deep.
that God loves me, I have to practice by loving you. It's not just to be a good person. I give you the forgiveness that I want. I want salvation, so I give it to you, or so I give it to myself.
And that's
Whew.
ultimately why we can't forgive others, right? Because
Right.
like the expectation that people should be perfect in order to
Yep.
be worthy of love is what we are putting on ourselves. And then we
That's right.
start to project that onto others. And yeah, I think it's like the more self-forgiveness I have had over the years, the more I am able to just like I don't know. I don't really have a lot that I'm like judging, I mean,
Yeah.
obviously human, but like it just becomes so much easier. I'm like, I often say, like, there is very little I will see a parent do. I mean, some things, but for the most part, I'm like, well, I'm sure they're doing the best that they can because it's freaking
I had
hard.
this conversation about leashes the other day with somebody, and I was like, he's like, absolutely not. And I was like, I mean, I'm just saying, like, if you had a kid like my
Well,
brother,
listen.
I could kind of understand why my mom wanted a leash for him. Like, you ever seen that video,
Yeah.
that old video that was circulating forever ago? I think it was like in a Verizon store where the mom was like slowly dragging that toddler through the store, and he was laying on the ground. I mean, listen, I guess today and I
You're
are
like, I'm
saying,
sure she was pushed.
I get it. I'm sure, he was being a real monster. They needed a leash.
Yeah, that's real. It's the
Uh,
ultimate, like, will humble you. Like, talk about an ego death. There is nothing like a child to like, what do
nope,
you think you know about life in the world? Hold my
nope.
beer.
And I think my mom personally loves it when I share these little things with her, like these meltdown moments where I'm like,
Mm.
and then I da da da, and this happened, and she's like, yeah. How'd you like
Hard,
that?
huh? But
Tell me
that's
about
so
that.
real. I mean, how many of us are like judging our parents and then you like have a child and you're like,
Oh shit.
I'm sorry. That was hard. You're right. I was an a-hole. Like I said something yesterday
Truth.
about like I was like, oh, because my mom will be like, just make him wear the shoes. And I'm like, this child is an Aries. You think I just tell him to do anything and he does it? She's like, reminds me of someone else I know, Dene. I was like, are you talking about me? She's
Me?
like, yes, Dene, you are a very strong-willed child. I was like, oh, fascinating.
Here we are. Half of my daughter's chart is in Capricorn. So yes, I understand.
I mean,
I very much understand.
Yeah. Tell her nothing.
No, you can't. You can't tell her anything. And so I just give up. I'm like, cool, just go to school without shoes on. That's where I'm at these days. I'm like, all right, well, just don't brush your teeth and then let everybody make fun of you for having bad breath. And she's like, Mom. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to fight you on it. Like, make your choices, have the consequences. I don't know what else to tell you. I'm sick of hearing myself talk.
No, I mean, that's real.
Yeah. Whatever. Do
It's
you,
breath.
boo? Do you, boo?
It gets to be an autonomous, sovereign constellation
That's right.
of your life together.
That's right. Well, anyway. Well, this was a nice bird walking episode.
Like, what do we even call
this episode?
What were we talking about? It's been like an hour. Anyway.
Oh, I don't know. Well, thanks for listening to us bird walk, everybody. Hopefully that was helpful.
It's something in there.
Something in there. Let us know. Either way.